In this video, we're going to learn how the nervous system regulates the rate at which the heart beats, both from inside of the heart itself, which is what we call intrinsic control of the heart, and how the brain directly increases or decreases the rate at which the heart beats, which is what we call extrinsic control of the heart. So if we start with intrinsic control, we need to talk about these two structures here, which are nerve centers that basically act as miniature brains within the heart itself, which are what we call your cardiac nodes. And the reason why we can say that each of these functions as a miniature brain in and of itself is that even if the brain loses its function, each of these nerve centers, each of your cardiac nodes, can function completely independently of the brain, which is why it is actually possible to keep the heart beating if each of these nerve centers has a constant electrical signal, even if the brain has long since died. And this is how it's actually possible to keep a person's heart beating even after the brain has failed and after a person has been declared brain dead. And the more important of these two nerve centers is what we call your sinoatrial node, meaning that it is located within the sinus, within the open top part of the right atrium here. And as we can see from the direction that is taken by the signals sent by the sinoatrial node, the job of the sinoatrial node is to cause systole of the atria. And we remember from the previous video that systole is just a fancy word which means contraction of the muscle. So every time that the sinoatrial node sends a signal to the neurons or nerve cells that control the muscles of your atria, it is telling them to contract and therefore push all of the blood that they have accumulated down into the ventricles. Now, because this is the first stage of the cardiac cycle, contraction of the atria and pushing blood down into the ventricles, the rate at which the sinoatrial node sends its signal determines the rate of heartbeat, which is why we call this your natural pacemaker, in that it sets the pace at which your heart beats. Now, the secondary nerve center that is found in between your atria and your ventricles is what we call naturally your atrioventricular node, indicating exactly where it is found, and its function is somewhat similar. So its job is to transmit the signal received from the sinoatrial node, or SA node for short, and transmit that signal to the neurons or nerve cells that directly control the muscles of your ventricles. And in the same way that the SA node's job is to regulate contraction of the atria, the atrioventricular node's job is to regulate the contraction or systole of your ventricles, thereby allowing blood to be pumped out of the heart to where it needs to go. So if we look at the pathway taken by the nerve signal sent by the AV node or atrioventricular node, we can see that this nerve signal passes through a series of connective nerve cells, which are what we call interneurons, because they fall between the atrioventricular node and the neurons or nerve cells that directly control the ventricles. And these connective nerve cells here are what we refer to as your bundle of His. His is actually an acronym, and so we write it in all caps like this. And when the bundle of His takes the signal sent by the AV node and transmits it to the nerve cells or neurons that directly control the ventricles, these being what we call motor neurons. Motor obviously referring to motion here, because these are the neurons directly connected to muscles. These neurons here are the ones that directly cause the contraction of the muscles within the ventricles, thereby pushing blood out of the heart. And these motor neurons, the ones that directly control the muscles in the ventricles, have a rather awkward name to remember, named after a Czech biologist who discovered them. These, in English, we would pronounce this Purkinje, so these would be your Purkinje fibers, although in the original Czech, it would be pronounced something like Purkinje. So Purkinje fibers or Purkinje fibers if you don't want to bother with the original pronunciation. And the reason why the sinoatrial node and atrioventricular node are needed independently of each other is because of the cardiac cycle. If the atria and ventricles contracted at the same time, blood would be pushed down and it would be pushed back up at the same time, and the heart would not beat in the proper rhythm. So the approximately 0.85 seconds delay between when the sinoatrial node signals and the atria contract and the atrioventricular node signals and the ventricles contract, this delay is needed for blood to be transferred down into the ventricles so that the ventricles are full before the AV node signals and squeezes the blood back out of the heart, allowing it to leave the heart and allowing the rhythm of the cardiac cycle to work properly. Now, in the second half of the video, we need to talk about extrinsic control, which is controlled directly from the brain. So if we remember the location on the brain stem that regulates all of the involuntary motion and involuntary control that is required in the body, this is what we call your medulla oblongata. And in the same way that the medulla oblongata regulates the respiratory system, the medulla oblongata can do the same thing for the heart. It can either speed up your heart rate or it can slow down your heart rate depending on what the environment dictates is needed. For example, if your brain recognizes that you need to undergo a fight or flight response, for example, if it perceives a very, very strong danger, this part of the medulla oblongata, or one part of the medulla oblongata, what we call the cardio, we should spell that properly, the cardio excitatory center. The cardio excitatory center, and we can kind of figure out what this name means because we can see the verb excite is the root of this word here, and if we know that cardio is the prefix that means heart, the cardio excitatory center's job is to excite the heart and trigger what we call a sympathetic response, if I can actually spell that word properly. Remember that the word sympathetic response is just the scientific name for the fight or flight response. And if this happens, the cardio excitatory center will send a signal directly to the SA node, increasing the frequency at which the SA node would fire. So instead of firing every 0.85 seconds, now the delay between firing is going to be shorter, and that means that overall we would get a faster heartbeat. Now, a number of students will recognize that a sympathetic response is also called an adrenal or adrenaline response. That's because adrenaline is the hormone that is largely responsible for affecting a sympathetic response. So whether it is directly influenced by the medulla oblongata or whether an increase in the presence of adrenaline in the body does it, both of these effects will cause an increase in the rate at which the heart beats. Now, the problem about sympathetic responses, which is the same problem with breathing, the longer a body stays in fight or flight mode, the faster the heart beats and the more energy the heart consumes. And obviously, this is not sustainable in the long term, which means eventually the heart rate is going to need to slow down when the heart begins to run out of energy and is not able to sustain its faster heartbeat, which is where the medulla oblongata shuts off the cardio excitatory center and activates what we call the cardio inhibitory center. And from the word that we can actually see is the root here, inhibit, which means to stop, this naturally shuts off the fight or flight response and triggers in its place a parasympathetic, if I can spell it properly, There we go. A parasympathetic response, also known as a rest and digest response, which is necessary not just to prevent overworking of the cardiac muscles, but also as a way to recuperate the energy that was consumed. So naturally, if we want the heart rate to slow down in order to not waste as much energy, this means that the medulla oblongata will signal the sinoatrial node to decrease in its activity, which means that instead of signaling every 0.85 seconds, the delay between when the SA node fires is going to be a little bit longer, therefore resulting in a slower heartbeat than previously. Now, just like how the sympathetic response has a hormone independent of the medulla oblongata that can regulate it, the parasympathetic or rest and digest response has its own hormone mediator as well, which is a hormone that we call acetylcholine. So acetylcholine and adrenaline are opposing hormones, meaning that when one is active, it shuts off the activity of the other and produces the opposite effect. So while adrenaline would result in a faster heart rate, acetylcholine will also result in a slower heart rate or in a decreased heart rate, because again, acetylcholine is the hormone that primarily regulates the parasympathetic response throughout the body in order to conserve energy and prevent the cardiac muscles from being overworked. In the next video, what we're going to look at is, now that we've been introduced to how the cardiac cycle works in terms of muscle contractions and how it is regulated, the final video in this series will look at how we measure the activity of the heart by measuring blood pressure, and will also describe what exactly blood pressure is in terms of the internal water pressure within the blood vessels of your body.